Afternoon. My name is Aaron Taylor, and I serve as Executive Director of the AccessLex Center for Legal Education Excellence. And this is the Pursuing Student Diversity in a Post-Affirmative Action World plenary session. The U.S. Supreme Court will soon announce its decision in the Students for Fair Admissions case. This case is the latest legal challenge to the use of race-conscious affirmative action in higher education. And based on the composition of the court, it is broadly expected that the court will severely limit or prohibit the consideration of applicant race in higher education admission. And if that indeed happens, this decision will have broad implications beyond the admission office. Today, I'm joined by three people who will engage us in a discussion of two general topics. The first topic is the potential and likely impacts of a decision to end the use of race-conscious affirmative action. And the second topic is approaches that schools could take in enrolling diverse classes, even if the court rules as expected. Our first panelist is Dean Ebony Nelson, who serves as Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law. And she will discuss research she and a colleague conducted on the viability of an array of race-neutral applicant characteristics that schools could use as admission criteria in fostering diverse entering classes. Our next panelist is Mario Ernesto Lopez. Mario serves as Director of DEI Initiatives at UC Law San Francisco. The law school enrolls one of the most diverse student bodies in the country, despite California's long-standing ban on the consideration of race in public university admission. And Mario will share with us some of the ways the law school succeeds in enrolling such diversity in a race-neutral environment. Our third panelist is Jason Scott. Jason serves as Director of Research with AccessLex, and he is going to discuss research he and his team have conducted on the impacts of state-level affirmative action bans on law degree attainment for underrepresented people. Now, as you're listening to the panel, please feel free to send over questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to leave ample time for Q&A at the end of the panelists' remarks in order to get a sense of the things you're concerned about and answer those questions. Now, before I turn it over to the panelists, I do want to set the tone for the forthcoming discussion, at least as I see it. So at its core, affirmative action is a system of preferences. And while the history of the term renders it synonymous with race, really any affirmative efforts by law schools to attract students who possess certain characteristics or background experiences is affirmative action in its most literal sense. So for example, when a law school seeks to attract students with high standardized test scores or favorable GPAs or post-college work experience, the manners in which these students are preferenced in the admission process and the scholarship awarding process, that is affirmative action. And so I make this point to make the point that the systems of preferences, the varying forms of affirmative action that underlie a school's admission process are reflections of how the school defines merit. That's what this is really about, in my opinion. So when schools engage in race-conscious affirmative action, they do so because they value the educational benefits of people with varying life experiences and varying perspectives, sharing the same space and interacting in the classroom and beyond. Therefore, coming from an underrepresented background is considered meritorious due to the diversity of thought and the diversity of perspective that the applicant may bring to the law school community. The school may also be motivated by notions of equity, with awareness of how race and ethnicity determine much about one's access to life's best opportunities. So an applicant who has overcome tangible manifestations of systemic racism may be considered meritorious and therefore worthy of preferencing. A Supreme Court decision banning the consideration of race won't make these characteristics or these experiences or these accomplishments any less meritorious. And institutions should not behave as if the decision does that. It would be an immense dereliction of public duty, which I believe we all have as educators and as gatekeepers of this profession. It would be an immense dereliction of duty to take the decision we expect as a hopeless defeat or even permission to be unconcerned about providing pathways to the profession for people from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds. Now, unfortunately, a decision banning the consideration of race will make enrolling diverse classes harder for most schools, because the basic truth is the most efficient way to enroll a racially diverse class is to consider race in the admission process. Therefore, diversity work in a race-neutral environment will require commitment, resources, efforts, probably beyond what is currently being expended. But as we'll see in this session, there are tangible things, tangible strategies that schools can and should adopt. So as you're listening to our presenters, consider how your institution defines merit. Consider how your institution conceptualizes who deserves an opportunity to study law at your law school, particularly in the context of racial and ethnic diversity, and then consider ways in which your recruitment efforts and your admission and scholarship criteria can be adapted to the new reality that we're expecting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all and with my fellow panelists. Thank you, Aaron, for moderating such an important discussion. My time is short, so as much as I'd love to go on and on about the research that my team and I have been working on, I'm going to use it more to share shortly about a bit about what we did and why we did it. But I'm going to focus more on the potential ramifications of our research and their findings, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's anticipated decision to overturn race-based affirmative action. So there are two quotations from the Grutter decision that really stand out and were really at the heart of what we were studying, because they're at the heart of really the case before the Supreme Court. And one is this quote that educational benefits flow from a diverse student body. And the other that this timeline, which was rather optimistic and I think somewhat arbitrary, that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary. So these are important questions, especially since we're a little more than 20 years in that 25-year timeline. So we set out to examine more closely those two statements. And what we found is illuminating. Banning race-conscious affirmative action diminishes the proportion of underrepresented people of color completing their JD degrees. And there are benefits, indeed, to greater student diversity on law school campuses, because they're associated with better student outcomes en masse. And so to the first point related to affirmative action and its role in diversifying law school campuses. We looked at the 4 states that implemented an affirmative action ban between 2007 and 2011. And we compared them to states that did not and had not previously. And we looked at what happened to the proportion of underrepresented people of color completing their JD degrees in those 2 different groups. We limited our study to public law schools because the legislation banning affirmative action were state level, and therefore public law schools were those affected by the legislation. And we found that on average, across all states and years, adopting an affirmative action ban led to a 6 percentage point decrease in the proportion of underrepresented people of color receiving or completing their JD studies. So that means going from, say, having a 20% minority JD completion rate to about a 14% completion rate. So, but this effect's not static. It changes over time. So 1 year after implementation, states that implemented a ban saw a decrease of 4 percentage points just 1 year after. And it was 6 years after implementation, they saw a 10 percentage point decrease. So what this really suggests is that the effect of affirmative action bans isn't this one short-term blip or even just a temporary blip. it's a problem that grows over time. And so rather than kind of focus on these abstract numbers, I wanted to give kind of an example using a simple hypothetical small law school that graduates on average, say 100 law students. So say 20% of the students at this law school typically graduates identify as an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority. If that school is located in a state that implements a ban in 2008, we'd expect the number of graduates identifying as one of these underrepresented minorities to drop to 16 in 2009, to 11 in 2012, and down to 10 in 2014. So that's a dramatic jump or drop. But we really have a dual-edged sword here. So whereas the school had 20 underrepresented minorities graduating before the ban, they had 80 white and Asian graduates before the ban. 6 years later, you have 10 underrepresented minorities completing their degrees, but you have 90 white and Asian grads. So you're not only seeing a drop, but you're seeing an increase. So the gap between the two groups is actually growing at a larger rate than just the drop itself would be considered. And take into account too that over the same time period, the population of the proportion of the population identifying as a minority within these states would increase from 20 to 22% on average. So the conclusion that we draw from this is that these race neutral policies leave something to be desired from a racial equity standpoint. We assume that the states or the schools in these states that adopted bans are still trying to diversify their law school campuses, but this drop persists nonetheless. And so we expect the Supreme Court's decision is likely to have a similar effect on a national level, although it's likely to be a little bit larger because it will affect not only public institutions, but we think private ones as well. And so there are consequences that these decreases in completion and diversity on campuses that are a result of these affirmative action bans. So in a second and related study, we looked at how campus diversity was related to student attrition, GPA, and bar passage. And we used the data set that we had compiled on an earlier project in which we partnered with 22 law schools in the Law School Survey of Student Engagement. And we took into consideration a school's selectivity and a few other control variables and found that greater campus diversity was associated with decreases in student attrition for all racial groups, generally higher final GPAs, and higher first-time bar passage rates for Black graduates. So in summation, and where I really want to leave the conversation is the Supreme Court's decision is likely to have a long-lasting negative impact on the racial ethnic diversity of law school campuses and ultimately on the legal profession itself, which is already extremely predominantly white. So with fewer underrepresented students on law school campuses, as a result of affirmative action going away, our findings suggest that these students may have a harder time on campus, and we might be able to therefore expect greater student attrition and less favorable outcomes for historically marginalized groups. So we'll need to do a couple of important things. One is increase the supports that we provide to these students. But two, if we've not already done so, we need to carefully and with the utmost urgency consider what else we can do to ensure the diversity of our law school campuses if we can't consider race in this our admission decisions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that very interesting and sobering presentation. Of course, I want to thank Aaron and AccessLex for the opportunity to be engaged in this conversation with such distinguished experts and researchers and administrators. So thank you so much for your great work in this important issue. I also want to thank AccessLex because they supported the research that my colleagues and I engaged in 2016 and 2017, looking at the viability of race-neutral alternatives as we think about a day that had already come in several states, but that is unfortunately likely to come in maybe all states, depending on how the opinion goes this summer, with regards to diversity and the ability to use race-conscious affirmative action to achieve diversity. So I partnered with two outstanding colleagues, Dr. Ronald Pittner, who is now a professor and chair of the Department of Social Work at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and Professor Carla Pratt, the Ada Lewis Sipquill Fisher Chair in Civil Rights, Race, and Justice in the Law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. And we conducted, again, this research, and we decided to embark on this work due to our concerns about the lack of racial diversity in law schools, as well as in the legal profession, and the precarious state that the race-conscious affirmative action and the future of race-conscious affirmative action, particularly immediately after the Fisher cases in 2013 and 2016, Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin. But of course, we know that it's even more of a precarious state now. So if you recall with the Fisher cases, in both cases, the court upheld the pursuit of educational benefits of a diverse learning environment as a constitutionally permissible goal, but it stressed the importance of employing narrowly tailored means to achieve that goal. So the question, according to the court, is whether considering race is necessary. And this was really the first time that we saw this language in Fisher, of whether or not it is necessary for a university to achieve its diversity goal is of paramount importance to the court's narrowly tailoring inquiry. According to the court, utilizing race-conscious admissions plan is permissible if an institution of higher education, and I quote, could achieve sufficient diversity without using racial classifications. The court stated that if a non-racial approach could promote substantial interest about as well and at tolerable administrative expense, then the university may not consider race. So therefore, we found that the impact of race-neutral alternatives on the admissions process was central to the question as to whether or not a school is engaging in constitutionally permissible race-conscious affirmative action. And as Jason has detailed to us, I'm sure all of us are familiar with the dramatic declines in acceptance and enrollment rates for students of color looking to attend college and law schools in states such as California, Michigan, and Florida following the elimination of race-conscious affirmative action. And despite the progress that has been made from decades of effort and millions of dollars spent to achieve greater diversity, we know that there remains a real issue with regards to lack of diversity in our law schools and of course in our legal profession, touted as one of the least diverse professions out of all of them. And so we know, as Jason has said, that it is quite difficult for schools to successfully employ race-neutral alternatives so that they are continuing to achieve their educational goals that flow from a racially diverse student body. And so what our study attempted to do, our study examined the relationship between the racial background of first-year law students and their race-neutral identity factors. And we sought to engage in this effort to assist law schools back then as a way to experiment with race-neutral alternatives in their admission cycles to see how viable other criteria, other admissions factors could play in their admissions decisions and in achieving their goals. And so what we did is we collected data from first-year law students enrolled at public ABA-approved law schools in jurisdictions that permitted race-conscious affirmative action in higher education. We surveyed law students, first-year law students at 10 law schools throughout the country. And in selecting those 10 schools, we looked at things like geographical region, campus setting, urban, suburban, rural, size, U.S. News and World Report ranking, as well as, of course, law school interest in participating. And thankfully, the administrators and deans of the law schools where we participated allowed us to come and actually administer the survey ourselves when the students were all assembled, as opposed to just emailing them the survey. So we had quite a participation rate, an 88% overall participation rate with a little over 1,000 participants. And so we have asked the students to complete a 29-question survey that measured demographics like race and gender and ethnicity, as well as attitudes about diversity in law school, as well as 22 what we call race neutral identity factors. And these were factors that were looking at students' racial identity, race neutral identity factors, looking at their educational background as well as their family background. So some of the examples of the race neutral factors that we asked students about was whether or not they attended public school, whether or not they had racial minorities were the majority of their high school. Did they receive free or reduced lunch in their K through 12 education? Did they work while in law school? Were they the first to graduate high school or college? Were they the first to attend law school? Did they contribute 20 plus hours a semester of service to underserved populations during their undergraduates? So there were 11 of these race neutral factors that dealt with the student's own educational background. And then we also asked students about 11 race neutral family background items. And some of those were as follows. Did they grow up in a single parent household? Were they raised by a guardian? Were their parents under the age of 20 when they were born? Was their family income while in high school greater than $75,000? Did they have a parent who had been incarcerated or a family member who had been incarcerated? Was they raised in a predominantly minority neighborhood, or were they raised in a predominantly low income neighborhood? And so while we looked at demographic and descriptive statistics with regards to how individual students responded to those different factors, we also engaged in inferential statistics and factor analysis, and we realized that we had, out of these 22 factors, that they really grouped together in 4 different factors in the student educational background and 3 different factors in the family education and the family background. And so those 4 factors on the student background was financial need, high school characteristics, family first status, and ethnic or race focused high school or college. And then on the family, it was family financials, family incarceration, and family composition. And so after we ran our analysis, we found that African American and Hispanic students were significantly more likely than both white and Asian Pacific Islander students to endorse race neutral factors such as qualifying for free or reduced lunch programs in K through 12 education, working for pay for 10 or more hours while enrolled in high school or an undergraduate program, receiving a Pell Grant during their undergraduate education, and attending a high school where racial minorities comprise the majority of the student body. We also found that African Americans in our study endorsed more race neutral factors, more race neutral factors than other students, which suggests that using race neutral factors may be particularly important for maintaining current levels of African American students in public law schools. And so what we wanted to do with this study was to show the relationships between some race neutral identity factors and to go to what Aaron stated in his opening remarks. Our goal was to allow this experiential tool that law schools could use as they think about what does qualify as merit when it comes to assembling your law school bodies. The fact that you have students that are coming from a wide variety of backgrounds that have experienced challenges, whether that's from a socioeconomic standpoint, whether that's from having families and family members and parents and guardians engaged in challenging life circumstances like incarceration. The fact that you're able to still achieve and overcome those challenges, those are important factors in assembling a diverse student body who's going to contribute to the educational enterprise that is going on in your law school, that will then contribute to the legal practice and to our profession. We know, as Jason was just mentioning, we know that there are benefits that flow from these diverse educational environments. And so it's important that we think about ways, even if we're no longer allowed by the Supreme Court to consider race directly, are there other factors that are part of a student's background that we want to be sure that we are intentionally trying to assess? Some of your admissions documents and some of your applications may already ask students specifically about some of these factors. Some of your applications, I'm sure, ask for essays in which students may talk about these factors. But for those that aren't directly asking about them, perhaps that's something we want to think about implementing as a way to try to continue to obtain a very rich and very diverse educational experience for our students that's preparing them adequately for the multicultural and diverse world in which they will be living, and most importantly, in which they will be practicing and advocating. And so I thank you all for your commitment to this important endeavor, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. And with that, I will pass it on to Mario.
Thank you very much, Dean Nelson, and for all the great work that you've done. I also want to thank Aaron, Jason, and AccessLex for the opportunity to speak to you before today, and for us to have this very important discussion. As we wait for the Supreme Court to make this pending decision that many court watchers, academics, political commentators, and us in legal education wait for, we believe that the court most likely will overturn the ability for schools to use affirmative action or race-conscious decisions in the admission process. Now, I wanted to speak to you first, a little bit of background here in California as a setting, and also to give you the effects that not using affirmative action has had on our state, but also the opportunities as we work together through this decision. But before I start, I'll say this. The difference between 1996 in California and today is that you are not alone. Whether you're a law school administrator or you're a pre-law advisor, you have many of us throughout various states that are ready to help you as you navigate through these challenges. Our mission is simple. It is to advance legal education. It is to advance opportunity at our schools and in our country, in our legal system, and you have people behind us. So let's go back to 1996 in the state of California. Voters approved Proposition 209, which was a constitutional amendment prohibiting state institutions, specifically public agencies, public employment, and public education, from the use of race, ethnicity, and sex in the determination of their functions. As it related to education, that meant schools, both at the University of California level and at the California State University level, again, only public agencies could not use race as a factor. What were the effects of that? Devastating for many, many students in our state. We saw in just 1 year significant drops in diverse student body populations. Perhaps no greater decrease than that in Black and African American students at our schools, both at the undergraduate level at UC and CSU and at the UC Law level, and also across other professional schools. Now, it was a tough time for UC schools and CSU schools, specifically law schools, post Prop 209. But schools were resilient. In fact, I want to give a big shout out to some of my colleagues here that I noticed are in attendance that have worked very hard on these issues throughout California, and specifically our UC schools, to be able to address what we could do legally, again, fully following the law, and at the same time, keeping our mission of a public institution in advancing diversity. So what are the things that we've done? Well, first, when we review an application, we can't consider race. In fact, we don't even see it. It's suppressed in our application, so we can't see that. We can't use it. Again, abiding by the law. what are the things that we can do to help make sure that we have a diverse class? Well, first of all, our outreach programs. One of the first things I want to say to you in states where this decision may affect you is be deliberate about your outreach programs. Make sure that you have a strong pipeline from high school through college. Here in California, we have a program called California Pathways. It's a joint venture with the California Community College Association and law schools, high schools, community colleges, and four-year universities, of which both are public and private. But what they do is that they help us, again, go into the communities where we know we have the highest number of diverse students, specifically also with diverse socioeconomic needs, and be able to build that pipeline from the very beginning. Second, another approach that we've taken here in California is making sure, again, on the recruitment process that we involve our students, our faculty, our staff, and our alumni in the entire recruitment process. At the end of the day, prospective students want to hear most from students and alumni. So we work very closely here at our school and across our University of California campuses to ensure that our students are able, our prospective students are able to see what great things our students and alumni are doing. Another thing that we have done here in the state of California is making sure that we go to all the fairs that we can, recruiting in areas where, again, we know there are going to be diverse populations, and this is where you need to get creative, right? This is where you need to work with partners, where you want to establish those relationships with pre-law advisors, of which we have many on this call today. We have a great organization here, CAPLA, similar organizations across the country also exist, but bringing them to campus, showing them the value, showing them what opportunities their current undergraduate students will have by coming to our respective universities. Another thing that we have done here in California is making sure that we value diversity and putting that clearly in all our materials on our website and having leadership from top to bottom speak about it. Here in California, we are proud to be the most diverse state in the union, and our classrooms reflect that. Those have been some of the great things that we've done in the state to address Proposition 209, which quite frankly may be a template for what the Supreme Court will use if they go ahead and overturn affirmative action. Now, those have been successes, but there's also been challenges for us here in California that we are still have not yet recovered from. The reality is both Black and Hispanic and Latino students continue to not enroll at the same percentages that we had prior to Proposition 209 in 1996. And the biggest area where we still lack is in Black and African American student enrollment. That is still a great challenge for us here in California, even with all the recruitment strategies that we've implemented as a state. Now, I also want to point out some opportunities and big distinctions between 1996 and today when Proposition 209 was enacted in the state of California. First, social media. Social media is actually a great opportunity for us to be able to reach across state lines, be able to reach into communities where folks want an opportunity at a legal education. Second, the focus that there is today on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, its importance. Take a look at this panel today. Take a look at the organization of AccessLex. These things were not as readily available back in the 90s in California as they are today. Third, the focus by institutional leadership and by legal services clients demanding that they want diverse attorneys. That is a great opportunity. So while the court may overturn affirmative action, the private sector is still demanding that the firms that serve them, that the lawyers that serve them come from diverse backgrounds because they understand the value it has to their clients. That's a great opportunity that we should continue to lean in harder and harder. That way we can make sure that we can show to prospective students, this is the opportunity that you have. Those are some of the differences that exist today compared to 1996. But make no question about it, the challenge is going to be big. This will have a huge impact on students of color and diversity. Our research has also shown that while we are able to increase diversity of students of color in our schools, the one area that we still lack huge is socioeconomic diversity. These policies disproportionately impact folks that come from lower socioeconomic barriers. So one of the things I suggest as it relates to merit, right? Merit is whatever each institution defines it as. One of the things that we've taken a look here at UC Los Francisco is adversity. Adversity is broadly defined. It includes various areas. And again, it's 100% compliant with Proposition 209. So that gives us the opportunity to take a look at various factors of the research that Dean Nelson did. And we're able to use similar factors when it comes to determining adversity and also scholarship. So those are just some of the things that we've done here in the state of California. Again, we still have big challenges to go. We have not fully recovered. For example, in the state of California, 40% of our population is Hispanic, Latino. Our undergraduate population is 27% when it comes to Hispanic Latino students. Our Black population here in the state of California, 5%. Yet we're at the UC and CSU level. Our enrollment is barely over 4%. So we are still under those areas. We have never recovered fully from Prop 209. But I do want to end on a positive note and a note of hope for all of us here. Today, our 5 public University of California law campuses all have students of color enrollment of over 50%. It is a testament to the hard work of our institutions, of the people that work in them, and of the commitment by those to ensure that we do everything we can to enroll a diverse class. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists for very insightful remarks and perspectives. And so we're going to start the question and answer period, and we have a little over 20 minutes for it. And we've got a few questions to come in. So if you do have questions that you haven't posed, please submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we should have time to get to those questions. But I'll throw out a couple questions to start, and one of them is, and it's probably, I guess, more for Dean Nelson to start, but anybody can chime in on any of the questions. I do want to get a sense of what you think the court is going to do, because it seems as if they have 2 options. One, they can basically increase the evidentiary burden for a school that wants to consider race in admission, or at least just make it harder to justify considering race in admission. And then the second option is they can just outright throw out race as a compelling state interest, or diversity as a compelling state interest. In which direction do you think the court will go? Of course, we know we won't know until we see the opinion, but in which direction do you think the court will go?
You know, that's a challenging question. I think best case scenario, right, considering the current composition of the court, best case scenario would be your first option, that they still recognize the benefits, the societal, the educational, the democratic benefits of diverse learning environments as a compelling interest, but just ratchet up the standards of proof to make sure that we are engaged in narrowly tailoring ways to do so. But I fear that there's quite a lot of skepticism about the interest itself with several members of the current court. It will be interesting to see. I think that there are some members of the court who do see value in diversity, even though they may not agree with race-conscious affirmative action in this particular higher education admissions, context by which to pursue it. And so, when you think back to the oral arguments with regards to diversity in clerks, and Justice Kavanaugh, talking about the importance of having diversity with regards to his clerks, and thinking about, so am I not going to be able to actively try to have a diverse body of clerks anymore? And that seemed to not sit so well with him. And so again, he may be one of those deciding, votes like a Kennedy used to be or Justice O'Connor used to be that ends up tipping the scale one way or the other on the compelling interest prong, while nevertheless, raising the bar on the narrowly tailoring prong. I think that is perhaps what we can hope for, because I do believe that the benefits of diversity is a compelling interest and one that should be preserved and protected. Even if in this particular case, the court may find that the means were not narrowly tailoring. I hope, they go that route as opposed to completely forbidding the consideration of race in higher education admissions in any context.
Okay, and so I guess a follow-up to that, and Mario, this may fall directly in your wheelhouse. What would the scope of a ban on the consideration of race look like? So obviously admission, but I imagine we're also talking about scholarships. Are we talking about other aspects that flow, I won't necessarily say beyond the admission office, but things we don't squarely think about when we talk about admission?
Yeah. Unfortunately, most likely, yes. Right? This will impact scholarships. So, for example, in the state of California, we can't make scholarship determinations based on race. Right? So even if we know that there's a group that is disproportionately impacted, might benefit from having more scholarship, that's able to allow us to then enroll them. We can't consider that. So that's going to be a huge thing. And again, I go back to, it won't just be the impact that it has on your law school. It's going to be the impact that it has at the undergraduate level, which will have a direct impact in a few years at your law school matriculation levels. And that's based on all the data that we saw here in California. So scholarship is going to be huge. This is going to require, quite frankly, folks to be able to look at the law, what is permissible by the law, and again, to find ways to be 100% compliant, but to expand the ability for folks to get access to funding.
All right, and a quick follow-up to that. To what extent, and I don't even know if you can quantify this, so maybe you can just provide some narrative insights. To what extent do you think your work has increased given Prop 209 versus a world where Prop 209 did not exist?
Absolutely, it has increased significantly. We have to try harder. We have to work harder. We have to do, we have to be more creative. I also view that as a good thing, quite frankly, right? It pushes us to be better. It pushes us to go into communities that sometimes are overlooked. I look at this as an opportunity for us, right? The reality is this decision most likely is going to happen. So if it does, let's make the most of it. And let's show that while some may want to limit diversity, we're going to overcome that. And we're going to work harder and harder. And in fact, hopefully one day, bring in the most diverse classes across all 50 states. But it will be a challenge.
Now, Jason, a question for you. In the research that you and your team did, there appeared to be, I guess, progressive or declines that became progressively worse as time went by. So you had the affirmative action ban come in the states, and then 5 years later, there was an impact. 10 years later, there was a worse impact. Could you explain that phenomenon and then probably provide some insights into why that was the case?
That's tough to say, although my guess would be that it's just something that kind of builds over time, that you have fewer students getting into law school and then completing their degrees, and that then has an effect on their sphere of influence and whether they're going to then pursue a law degree. So that's my best guess. And the second arm of that is that it affects the undergraduate institutions as well. And so what you're seeing, and to some extent, is that you're having fewer minority students complete their undergraduate degrees And so that's taking a little bit more time to trickle through as well. So you're getting a compounding of the effects.
Yeah, that definitely is sobering, and it really shows just how, in many ways, the feeder effects. We get lost schools get their students from undergraduate schools that may be shut out because of a ban like this. All right, so let's talk about things that law schools could look at, race neutral characteristics, race neutral factors that law schools could look at. And I really just have a general question. Basically, every study of class-based affirmative action, with the exception of maybe one out of the University of Colorado, but every other study I've read about class-based affirmative action says that it is not an effective way to promote racial and ethnic diversity. Does anybody have a sense of why that's the case? You jump in, Mario.
Yeah, Aaron. Recently, I spoke with Dean Chemerinsky, the dean at UC Berkeley Law. He was here on campus, and he answered the question directly, so I'm paraphrasing him. It's a simple math equation. The fact of the matter is that in our country, we have many of our fellow Americans who are poor, and many are white, and it's just a math calculation, right? The majority of our population in our country is white. We have a lot of poor and struggling white Americans. So if you just do it based on socioeconomics, it's just a math equation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I read something else that said even within the different strata, so let's just say you break up the population into 4 categories based on socioeconomics, there's still trends where Black and Latino people tend to be the poorest of the poor and the poorest of the rich, frankly. And so even within those groups, there are dynamics of privilege and disadvantage that play out, which makes class-based affirmative action less impactful. Dean Nelson, you all studied 22 factors, race-neutral factors that had value as, in some ways, proxies for race. Were there any that particularly stood out as being particularly impactful in terms of generating diversity in the entering class?
So again, we grouped factors together, but when we looked at that, some of the individual factors, when we kind of broke it out, just, things that were interesting, again, grew up in a single parent household. Of our cohort, 33% of our African-American students had grown up in a single parent household, 20% of our Hispanic, 21% of our Asian Pacific Islanders, while compared to only 15% of our white students who were part of that study. When you think about going back to the impact of socioeconomic status, and again, the measure with regards to family income greater than $75,000, well, again, $75,000 a year, 60% of our white students in our survey had that as an indication, compared to only 20% of our Hispanic population. And so, again, you see that impact of socioeconomic status. And I actually wanted to go back to your previous question with regards to that you were alluding to, is you have to think about even within those different strata of socioeconomic circumstance, there is privilege, there are resources, differentials. When you just think about schools, the kinds of resources that are available in poor schools versus poor and minority schools. And so again, you may have more of the guidance counselors in those poor white schools than you have in the poor Black and brown schools. And so again, that pipeline of students who are heading to higher education could be different, even though they may be, quote, the same when it comes to being from an economically challenged background. So I think it's important for us to think about the systems in which our students are walking and living and how that impacts their educational opportunities, access, and outcomes. But yes, some of those, race neutral family background indicators we saw being at higher proportions for some of our students of color than some of our white students.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about all of this in the context of the law school application. And so right now we have a law school admission process. It's not standardized per se, but there are a lot of standard aspects of the application. And I do know there's some reluctance on the part of many schools to not diverge much from kind of that standard framework, because of course you want to encourage people to apply to your law school and not discourage by requiring them to do a whole lot of different stuff that no one else is requiring. So I'm wondering, and Mario, this may be a good question for you to start. In what ways should, or what types of questions that are typically asked in a law school application should a law school ask if they're really seeking to enroll racially and ethnically diverse classes, but with no demarcation of race in the application? How does the application itself have to change?
I would say one way is to ask more about adversity, to try to get more of the context of where the applicant is coming from. To the points that Dean Nelson said, right? These are the things, what type of resources did you have in high school? What type of resources did you have even in college, right? The reality is, we know this, not all colleges are made the same and supplied with the same resources. Same thing with K through 12 of education. So really getting at the heart of what has been the applicant's educational arc. What type of support systems have they had? What type of services have they had? Another thing that we can ask, right, is going again to family adversity, right? What type of resources did your family have? Again, that is 100% consistent with the law, but it gives us a better picture of what the applicant is coming from. You know, and another thing is, I think this may be potentially an interesting thing to look at. I'm not saying it may be the solution, but to take a look at census tract data. Might that be an opportunity to again, get an indication, the same way that we have a numerical score, right? So that we have a GPA, an LSAT, or GRE. Maybe there's also a income census tract potentially. Again, I don't want to say that as 100%, but these are the type of questions that we need to look at. I also want to add something very quickly, is use what happened in California as a model. Many of our students post Prop 209 in 1996, many of our diverse students, right after, actually felt that the law prevented them from applying to college or to higher ed. Many actually thought, oh, with the banning of affirmative action, that actually means that they won't accept applications from folks like myself. That is not the truth. That was not the case then. That most likely will not be the case now, but that perception is real. Those barriers are real. So the opportunity that we have as law schools is we really have to double down during this period right after the decision to dispel that potential myth. And again, to show, no, we actually want you on our campuses. We want you in the profession.
And so in California, could you ask the question of whether someone is a descendant of a formerly enslaved person, for instance?
It's a great question. To my knowledge, right, it's not something that we have asked on our application, right? But that is a very interesting question.
Okay. Now, Jason, as I'm thinking about a lot of this, and I'm hearing in my mind, this is new data coming off the application. So we have, applicants providing zip codes, which tell us things about what's the average income in the area where they grew up and all this kind of stuff. And I don't expect a detailed answer to this, but is there a way a school could essentially turn this into data that's measurable that they can use in their admission process to better predict who can come in from, say, I don't know, a low-income area and thrive at the law school?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think there's a lot of things that schools could do. Of course, as Mario's already pointed out, I mean, the workload on their end to diversify their classes has grown significantly. You could for sure use the zip code to kind of use some type of demographic to find some demographic information and look at composition. You could look at the high school the student attended. All of that information is available through like Good Schools, I think is the website or something along those lines. And it's all readily available. When you look at what's on a student's CAS report, you could look at things like whether the student was the applicant was a Pell Grant recipient. And then for others, what we've found is that, you know, traditionally law schools will lean on an LSAT score and final undergraduate GPA, but those typically have or favor some type of racial disparities, which won't really be much of an assistance if you're trying to diversify your student body. So we have work in place that we'll soon kind of share preliminary findings on, where we kind of find an alternative measure that you can look at that doesn't produce those racial disparities and predicts academic success better than LSAT score and final UGPA. And we basically, as a sneak peek, it's looking at how a student's UGPA changes over their time during their undergraduate years.
And that's a great segue to a point I want to make sure that I put forth, and that is that AccessLex is a partner to law schools generally, but also in the context of law schools that are seeking to maintain or even increase diversity in the context of a race-neutral environment. And so we have a range of resources that are helpful to law schools, including many that are in the resources tab at the bottom of your screen. So be sure to review those. Also, we have programs, our Lex Pre-Law program, which assists people from underrepresented racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds through the admission process, provide them with resources they need to be the best applicants they can be. That program is currently accepting applications as we speak. And then we have our Lex Post-Bac program, which is our law school prep curriculum for people from underrepresented backgrounds who appear to have much potential and much promise, but the law schools that they apply to feel like they need a little more preparation before beginning the experience. So all of these programs are premised on helping diversify law schools, again, racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. And then lastly, we're developing a toolkit for law school administrators, specifically law school admission officers, in how to go about doing admission with diversity in mind in the context of a race-neutral environment. A lot of it will be the types of things that Mario does every day. And so Mario, will be leaning on you for information probably as we continue to develop this tool and this resource for law schools. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you again for your insights and your expertise and sharing your expertise. And that's the end of this session. Have a good afternoon, everyone.